Welcome everybody to the third Roxborough House Roundtables. Today we'll be discussing the Ray Rice sequela. Our host today is Professor Henry Buehner.
Yes, hello. I am Henry Buehner. I'll be moderating this panel. I'm an adjunct professor of history, law, and society at Philadelphia University. I'll ask all the panelists we'll go around the table just to name and identify what they do or what class they're in at Philadelphia University. So I'll start with my left.
Monica Levins, Law and Society.
I'm Mark Cavoni. I'm the Dean of Students and the Title IX Coordinator for the University.
David Rogers. I'm an Assistant Professor of Writing and Rhetoric.
Brian Hickey, an editor at Newsworks, WHYY, and a writer for Deadspin.com.
Caroline Allen. I'm a senior at Philadelphia University and a field manager for the Southern Poverty Law Center.
Tom Myers, intercollegiate athletic recruiter, men's soccer coach.
Grant Fox, student, law and society major.
Okay, so I only have an hour, and I have a lot because I was going to spend some time talking about why I wanted to convene this panel, because I've been soaking in a lot of, especially news, sports talk radio, about this Ray Rice situation, and a lot of things that people are talking about are worrying me. But I do want to lay down one kind of ground rule for this, is one that usually irks me very much, is I don't feel like we need to qualify all of our statements. I think we can at least go with the premise that what happened was a bad thing. We don't have to keep going, but So I really also want to kind of limit this to more institutional discussions, because there's a lot of pressures being put on the NFL and the Atlantic City Prosecutor's Office about and others about what should be done in this situation. So my questions are going to be very concentrated on those types of things. We can branch out, of course, but let's keep this more to the institutional intersections, convergences, and divergences of law and society. So one of the major issues I have when I was listening to many people talk about this on the radio is this notion, this kind of pretense that the NFL is a powerful corporation, and especially when Roger Goodell said he didn't have the tapes or he didn't see the tapes. How could we believe they couldn't have these tapes? And so this kind of assumption that because the NFL is as powerful as it is, it should be able to do whatever it wants, whenever it wants to do it, and they employ all these guys and such, and that troubles me, because at the end of the day, the NFL is a corporation like any other. Will we grant that kind of power to others? Or what I'm getting out of it is the NFL like a public trust? It's a quasi-governmental organization, and therefore they have this heightened responsibility to society. And in that, we can discuss the other, the kind of breakdown of other things as well. Does anybody want to react to that?
Well, I'd like to just add one quick thing, because I think all corporations have a responsibility, an ethical responsibility to the public. So I don't know if I would want to make that distinction. I mean, I understand the distinction that you are trying to make, but to my mind, corporate responsibility requires all corporations, because if they're going to be considered citizens by the U.S. government, then...
But the issue here is almost a quasi-legal responsibility. And while I agree, I think I agree with you on that there may be this responsibility. I don't know if it amounts to that, because that is one of those, responsibilities of government, is to be a regulator of society in quite that way. So I agree with you, but that's what I meant, particularly by that.
Corporations have an HR department, and according to the Human Resource Management, only something around 35% of companies have a policy that deals with domestic violence. But even with that policy, it's very vague, so they're having a huge problem with that. In terms of the NFL, just 4 days ago, they actually just assigned 4 women to deal with their domestic panel, one of which, who is already, as I believe, was the NFL's Vice President of Community Affairs and Philanthropy, and then they added 3 more women that are essentially experts on domestic violence. But I wonder if this will deter domestic violence at all.
Is domestic abuse a problem among athletes? Is it something, inherent, in the situation?
It's their second leading criminal, that's the second most prevalent criminal cases that come about in the NFL. I think there was 87 cases involving 80 players in the past 14 years where NFL players have been arrested for domestic violence. The only one leading that in the crime division would be the DUI, driving under the influence, stuff like that.
I was just going to say, I don't think it's just a problem with the NFL. I think it's a problem with society as a whole. And
So it's not a concentration in sports.
I don't feel it's necessarily concentrated in sports. I think it's just also a society issue. I mean, you see it, like you said, within different corporations. And I think that with the whole thing that happened with the Ray Rice case is obviously horrible. But at the same time, I think it's a bigger issue, including society.
Yeah, this is David, by the way. I would be careful to essentialize athletes as perpetrators of violence. I think it's a cultural, social issue that is pervasive outside of and inside of the NFL.
Would you be comfortable saying that the NFL has had more problems with domestic violence versus any other professional sport?
I don't know the data, to be honest with you, but I think it's about also what gets reported. The NFL has a more heightened media attention than a lot of other sports, especially in the United States. So, for example, soccer, I don't know the data of what kinds of forms of violence that it is taken in that sport, but it doesn't have the media attention that NFL has.
Monica?
I was gonna say that basically, like he said, the NFL is looked at a lot because it's like a main sport within America. Maybe baseball a little bit, but you don't look at the other sports within the United States. I feel that since especially the Ray Rice scandal gets so much media hype right now is because it's the NFL. And it's also just past football season. So I feel without the media hyping up the actual scandal, would it have been as big of a case as it would have been? Would have he been punished as much? I don't think so. I think just because he's famous and because he's an athlete, he gets more hurt put on him in legal standings.
So this is her, Monica.
Yeah.
Because one of the kind of follow-up questions I was going to ask is it appropriate punishment here that Ray Rice never play football again?
I think so. I think it was appropriate because as soon as he signed that contract, he became a representative of the brand and the organization of the Baltimore Ravens and of the NFL. And by sending a message that we're not going to tolerate domestic violence, especially in this extreme case, I think it sets a tone because the NFL is so iconicized and so part of the American culture. You can't be sending messages to the kids that condone that an athlete can get away with putting his hands on someone that he loves, that he says he loves, that he's going to marry. It's not, I don't know, yeah. It's not good business sense, it's not good ethical sense.
Well, I think in the Ray Rice case, which is a very interesting unfolding of the reality, when in fact, aside from the video, everybody knew what he did already, and then we got our imagination sharpened up by the fact that he hit his now wife with a closed fist with a sharp blow that knocked her out. She was unconscious in the other video when we saw her being dragged out of the elevator. So the furor around the specificity of the assault is really an interesting development. But getting back to the real point, should he be given a life sentence so that he can't work in the NFL? I'm not sure. Will anybody hire him? Different question. So in the free market, you might want to say, well, he paid his dues, or he went to jail, or he paid a fine, or he was suspended for a certain period of time, like Michael Vick. And then people can choose whether they want him to play for them or not, and sponsors can sponsor them or not. I think I tend toward the latter, that let the free market determine what people, sponsors, sports fans will tolerate, because we're tolerating it all over. This is not an NFL problem. This is definitely a problem in college sports and in other sports. It happens that domestic violence is the big issue of the day in the NFL, as if they invented it, which they didn't. Baseball, it was drugs. Something else will come up in another sport because of the high media attention and the fanatical interest in these sports by the American public.
Caroline,
Do you think that if there were stricter domestic violence policies already set in place, that there wouldn't have been as much as a hype? That way, when the Ray Rice incident did happen, they could internally figure it out, and then he wouldn't have been fired. So, for instance, they say, if you beat your wife, we have policies in place that say you have to go to therapy with your wife, you have to come to us every other day with a report, how things are going. Do you think a policy like that, if something like that was in place, that he should be able to continue to play in the NFL?
This is Mark again. If your question is directed at me. Obviously, when bad things happen, policies, public response, laws, regulations come up and are developed. So do I think that the NFL needs to have a very powerful statement about domestic violence and built-in punishments and responses? Yes, and that's what they're doing. They were too lax about it in the previous few months, years, however long the NFL has been going on. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
If I could interpose, I'm the announcer, Evan Lane. I just want to interpose one thing. What troubles me about the entire Ray Rice situation, yes, we have a video, we saw what happened. But if you have this reaction to domestic violence as severe as taking away a man's career, what does prevent a situation where a man has his wife or girlfriend and he's cheating on her, and to get back at him, she comes to the NFL and goes, he beat me yesterday. He's beaten me for months. And now that leads to him being automatically suspended. Isn't that a violation of due process? And this is not a small fine. These players make $30, $40 million. So by the allegation of one disgruntled person who may or may not be lying, you can take away tremendous amounts of money, which will never be recovered. That's what troubles me, and I was interested in what people thought of that, because that's what I think is not being discussed here. Let me ask you, the athletics department.
I mean, just in response to your question, I think in this type of situation, it's interesting because Ray Rice's, I believe, fiance wife dropped the charges. So it's interesting to see that different dynamic with the whole situation. But as you speak about with the money that's involved and different type of ways that a disgruntled wife or fiance could possibly get back at the NFL player. I mean, it's unfortunate in that situation, but I think again, it's important that the player also recognize his status within the culture. But then also at the same time, I think it's also up to the NFL to do their due diligence to make sure that they're covering and getting the whole story before they come to conclusion.
Well, may I interject for a second? I mean, the issue here is, but I think it's an apt one, is that, I mean, just because she does not want the law to press charges, the law can proceed. Now, they did not in this case, and that's another kind of issue here is when those who are entrusted with enforcing the laws kind of do selectively, and they do so for a lot of reasons. A lot of them, in terms of, this was done in municipal court. They've got a docket, bigger than this house. But the issue, but it does lead to the bigger issue, I think, in general, is that should an employer be able to terminate you from something you've done privately at home? And I know this was an elevator, but I mean that division here. And, one could say on one hand that, the NFL has that player conduct policy. How encompassing is that? Because in contract law, they have this concept called unconscionability, that the terms of it, yes, you may have to agree to them, but they don't make them global. Unless, should it be global? The NFL should be able to punish anyone from any action they do on and off the field. Does that make your employer then, also your morality police? That wasn't just on you. That's a weighty question, dude.
This is Monica, but it makes you think if a CEO had the same problem that Ray Rice was having, would he lose his whole job over it? Say he beat his wife in an elevator, would he be automatically disbanded from the company?
Well, I would argue that CEO probably would more easily lose his job than some guy in middle management. But should the guy in middle management lose his job because it's found out that he beats his wife?
Yeah, and I don't think that the guy in middle management would lose his job because he hit his wife. But then you look at somebody who's an athlete and who's famous, loses his whole job, his whole career over something like this that didn't even go to court, and she's not even pressing charges, and they're married. Like, is it right? I think it's right to maybe put him on a suspension, but to lose his whole career, like, that's pretty harsh.
The way I see it, I mean, I'm sorry, I mean, it is very business sense in the NFL, but I mean, football is a game, it's a privilege. And it's not a right for him to be able to play football and make money doing it. He was blessed by doing that. I mean, it's amazing that he can make millions doing that. But the fact that it's not a right, it can be taken away. And when you do it to a point, you do such a heinous act to a point where you put yourself in a situation to where that can happen, then those are the consequences. Yeah, that's all I got.
Well, if you can have a drug policy that has a death clause in it, you know, after so many violations, you're no longer able to function in sport or for a team, then why wouldn't one go into other areas like domestic violence or firearms issues or DUIs? In other words, all these teams and the leagues have character clauses and guidelines and due processes, whether they're good, bad, or indifferent, that are separate from the criminal courts. And I know from my work as on campus violence, we're required by the federal government to protect the civil rights of our students, and that means against domestic violence and rape and sexual assault, and we are not to wait for the adjudication processes, which may involve a huge caseload in the Philadelphia city. It may involve a victim that's reluctant to go for months or years in a criminal process. And we're required, within the bounds of our responsibilities in higher ed, to make sure that we protect the civil rights of our students. So, you know, I'm not sure the analog is as accurate as I would like it to be, but effectively, if there are expectations, we have expectations of our own athletes here. Scholarship athletes who sign forms, if they violate the character code or the expectations of us, we take their scholarships away. We can suspend them
How
from
much
the
evidence do
university.
you need to do
Certainly, that's fair play as long as the expectations are clearly articulated and the due process is observed.
Well, here's my topic.
Just to add to that, and kind of just to relate it to higher education and athletics, we have our processes just like Dean Buehner was stating, but at the same time, say there was a case on campus and a student athlete did commit such a heinous act, and we were to get rid of his scholarship and decide to transfer. Now that student will still have the opportunity to go to another school and play sports there. So I do agree that, you know, it was a heinous act, and I believe we all agree that, and I think there should be consequences for it. But I still believe that Ray Rice should have the opportunity to still compete and work in the NFL.
Deacon, I have a question for you directly on what you said. Let's say the student is a commuter student who lives 50 miles away, and they get into a domestic dispute. You know, that's at home. It's not even near campus. Are you required then to put university sanctions upon that, man?
Well, every question like that deserves the answer. That depends. All I'll say in terms of jurisdiction is that the university has jurisdiction over its students anywhere in the world while they're enrolled. And then we go to our code of conduct and other circumstantial issues to make a determination about whether that person is a danger to others, danger to themselves, a violent criminal, all those kinds of things. So if I were told that Joe beat his wife and his wife wasn't a student but Joe was, that would be cause for concern by the university, and we would have to investigate it.
So it's actionable.
Yes, it's the incident and the requirement to investigate is there. The outcome is not dictated.
Yeah.
If I could just turn it for a second. I've heard a lot, you talk about talk shows. Men and women coming on saying that a man has that right to what Ray Rice did, or she had it coming. I've heard that because she was arguing with him, she came at him, and it's a discussion I've been hearing that's part of the overall process. And I was interested in, Monica, what do you think of that as a female athlete?
As a female athlete, I think that that statement is 100% stupid. I'm sorry, but it's ridiculous that people think that just because she intimidated him means that he can hit her, especially punch her in the face and knock her out. That is absolutely ridiculous, and there's no grounds for anything. But what a lot of people don't realize is they say that she could have just left. She could have just left him. Like, she didn't have to stay there and argue. But when you're in a domestic abuse relationship like that, I don't think people realize that the women feel like they have no choice. They feel like they have to stay there. And that's a very big problem within our society. People don't understand. They think that the woman in the situation is dumb for staying with a man who beats her, but in reality, she's in that mindset that she has to stay there and that she has to depend on him. And that's also terrible. So in that situation, can you blame the woman?
In something like that, I just want to say, most domestic violence starts at the age between 20 to 24 years old. And what you were saying, women don't have a choice, and I 100% agree with you. What a lot of society doesn't understand is that men don't just get up and hit you the first week that they meet you, or else you would dip out very quickly. They emotionally abuse you at first and make you feel terribly. Just for sake of educating really quick, there's just a couple warning signs for us just to know as women, and something. I've been in an emotionally abusive relationship that almost became physical, and I never thought as a strong, independent woman that would happen. But after being down emotionally for 6 months, you start to question, maybe I do deserve this. So just some warning signs: if somebody's checking your cell phone, emails, social networks, extreme jealousy, insecurity, constant belittling and put downs, isolation from your family and friends, making false accusations, possessiveness, telling someone what to do, and repeatedly pressuring you to have sex. Those are just some things to watch out for. And I think that...
And any relationship in that state could turn to domestic violence.
All the
And at that point, they're both dependent on each other. There's flip sides. A girl could be physically abusing her boyfriend. You don't know. But there's flip sides to it. They could be dependent on each other, and then they get wrapped in this psychological thing that they have no way of getting out. So the fact that people will say that it's all the woman's fault because they stay, well, it's not. It's not at all. So it makes you think. But back to the thing. So.
No, I mean the natural question I think that may arise from that is, should the state force the couple to then break apart? They both can order them both to receive therapy. Is that how you deal with the situation then?
I think therapy would be a really great thing, but you can't really force people to do anything.
So then how do we solve the situation then? How do we fix this if it is a problem that needs to be remedied?
Well, for one, I think we're already working from a problematic premise. We're not defining our terms. We're already working and operating from kind of binaries where we're assuming that domestic violence only happens to women, for one. And two, we're not defining violence or acts of violence, because I think that a more interesting kind of question would be how do we punish violence, right? And I don't want to reduce or oversimplify violence against women, because it is absolutely more pervasive, and I'm not dismissing that. But I think that the ways that we continue to talk about these things continue to create grand narratives around these kinds of actual experiences and events that shape the way people think about it. Now,
does it take banning him for life from football for this reason to maybe be a groundswell towards a change in cultural attitudes? I know it's an isolated event.
No. I've been still thinking through that question. I don't know if I have an exact answer. I definitely think there should be punishment. And I do think, to another question that I do think I have a more concrete answer on, is when should your employer intervene and kind of monitor or regulate? I think that monitoring or regulating morality could be problematic, but violence and acts of violence, because I guess for me, I don't know if I'd want to be another employee with someone who is a perpetuator of violence. Do you know what I mean? But again, I'm still not defining, you know what I mean? Because we can talk about linguistic or violence with words, with, physical. Do you know what I mean?
Well, there's one aspect
And then
here. Sorry,
you
go
also,
ahead,
you also want to think about, I mean, when you think about violence, NFL is pretty much violence, if you think about it. Think about the number of injuries involved in football and just the way that the men are throwing their bodies around. So they automatically come from I want to say a violent environment or background, naturally, because it's a sport. And the way society thinks of it, it's almost like these gladiators.
Do we take it too seriously? And then that engenders that?
Are you saying just society?
The game, take it, it's a sport. I think that's an interesting distinction here. But society puts so much value on it that you have to go with the gladiatorial mindset, and then that changes the person.
I think it's something that the athlete naturally goes into. It's a mindset that the athlete has to go into to play at that level. But to kind of get back to your point, I mean, I totally agree with the violence part, and I think a big part of that is that, again, going back to the athletes, is that they're automatically involved in that environment. So when you talk about the physicality and the violent mindset, I think unfortunately, it's almost a part of it.
Caroline.
So I just have a question. When you weigh the pros and cons of Ray Rice and the domestic violence, there are so many cons of what he did. What he did is terrible. We can all agree with that. But how much justification on a weighted scale can you really put in to justify for him to keep his job? Are there any real points?
I guess the struggle that I have with the question is not, I think he absolutely should have lost his job for this year. Mm-hmm. The question is, if we're going to believe in the judicial system and if we're going to believe in the ways in which that system can, what's the word?
Operate,
and I want to say fix, but that's the terrible way.
Rehabilitate.
Rehabilitate, thank you. Someone, because there's still a part of me that wants to believe in that and wants to believe that I don't want to centralize people and think just because you've committed acts and maybe many that it's impossible for you to, become a
Come back from.
better
Well,
person.
I'm trying to think of banishment and the examples in American sports, and the one that comes to mind is Pete Rose, who was banished from the game of baseball and the Hall of Fame for gambling. So these things do go on, and laws and decisions are promulgated by the different sports, whether they be drugs or gambling, or in this case, domestic violence. So I think we're trying to figure out what's the real center point of determining how someone's career or ability to earn a living playing a sport could be affected for the rest of his life. And we just have lots of different examples, with gambling, ironically, being one of the most prominent corrupt activities, and I say that in air quotes, that has cost people their entire careers and reputations forevermore. So there's plenty of precedent for doing that sort of thing. And I raised the question of Michael Vick as an analog to this. Now, many would say that his actions in murdering pets, dogfighting, was as serious a crime as what Ray Rice did, yet he's sitting on the sidelines making millions of dollars with the New York Jets. So it's hard to find the boundary lines and the determinations, but it's definitely in the conversation, just exactly where are these sports going to go, because they look indifferent. They project these guys as big stars, they learn about stuff, and I think public pressure and legislative pressure will try to make these things more transparent and get the organizations to acknowledge what's going on and to have serious sanctions when they do.
Mark, just addressing, because you gave some examples, the drug situation had to do with performance on the field. The gambling situation with Pete Rose had to do with him possibly throwing or influencing games, which affects his sport. What Ray Rice did in no way affects his performance on the field, nor did it affect the sport. And that's the problems that I have a little bit.
And then along with that, then you also bring up, there's been issues with NFL players and getting DUIs. And then some of them have been allowed to play again after they're getting DUIs and getting car accidents and injuring other people. So, I mean, do you call that an act of violence, or, I mean, so it's kind of.
Should we have a zero tolerance policy? If you do a bad thing, you have to sit out. Caroline.
For domestic violence, absolutely. When you were talking about the government setting an example, we have due process. You shoot someone on the street and you're living in society as a whole, yeah, you deserve due process. You commit yourself to a workplace and you know the code of that workplace, and you commit a crime, you get fired from your job. You don't deserve due process. That's what happens.
But
I'm not disagreeing that he shouldn't be. He got fired.
Yeah,
it's
exactly.
that should he never get to have another job in that profession again?
So
I mean, I could get fired from Philadelphia University and still get a job at another university.
So I guess the question would be then, should all of the sports teams in the NFL then implement a policy that says if you were previously fired for domestic violence, you can never be hired again? Whereas what I'm arguing is that if you commit domestic violence, you should immediately be terminated. Not touching on the fact whether you should be hired again, that's up to the moral ideas of the...
Carolyn, would you hope that the moral code says you don't hire him again?
Absolutely.
Okay, so it should translate into a permanent ban then.
Go ahead. No, I was just going to say,
Caroline doesn't want to answer that.
I definitely think there should be consequence, no doubt about it. And to kind of, when you think about the whole situation, and like you said, he was fired. Now this gentleman was making a living off of playing the game, playing the sport. I think there will be some consequences for him. Obviously, if he's allowed to play again, that a lot of NFL teams will have to take a look at. But we also have to take a look at it's a bigger issue. Are you helping this person? It's a society issue. So I think if there are going to be any kind of implications, one should be counseling. Because at the end of the day, if you're letting this person go, he's still going back into the society, where it can happen again. So I think that's a big part of it, where there should have to be some type of therapy that goes on, included with that, so that if this gentleman does leave, maybe he does leave, but he goes into society, maybe a better person.
Yeah, I guess what I like a lifelong ban is symbolic to me, and not that symbolic power doesn't materialize and have real.
That was the basis of my question.
Right.
Do we have to make this example? If it's that important of an issue, this is what has to be done. This is the bloodletting.
No, I don't think so. And it's not happening. There's process. He's suspended indefinitely.
Yeah.
He was fired from his team, and this league suspended.
But should it be up to the commissioner of football, the commissioner's office, to be able to it's solely in the power of the commissioner to reverse that decision. Otherwise, that's indefinite. His future's in the hands of this one person.
Yeah, I don't know that is the case. There's a players' union. There's legal activity. He's appealed to be reinstated. There's a whole bunch of processes that most of us don't have any idea the depth and complexity of. So I think that if the question is, should the commissioner of a given sport have the ability to lay down a death sentence, figuratively speaking, it has been done. There are really famous commissioners who've done it. Should it be done in this particular context, in this case? I would say personally, no. That this is such a mess for the NFL. Going forward to make lifetime bans of athletes who make these mistakes and pay for them, and monetarily they face criminal charges, they get suspended, they lose enormous amounts of their careers. But I think I would really be worried if there was a long litany of activities that resulted one-to-one in absolute punishment that was intractable and irreversible.
Well, then I don't
think it's going to happen.
I have another, Brian.
I think a lot of people's problems with the lifetime ban go back to something you said in the introduction, and it's the discovery of this tape that was.
That's what I was going to turn to. So
yeah, and I wouldn't have a problem with Rice being banned for life if that had been the initial punishment. But it was the 2-game suspension, and then all of a sudden this tape that they say they haven't seen before pops up. Public groundswell is behind it, and they change course. It feels as if it's a sliding scale of justice driven by public opinion. And I covered crime in Atlantic City for 5 years early in my career. Could they not have had that tape? Yeah, because the casinos aren't very willing to cooperate with police in investigations in Atlantic City because it reflects poorly on their casino house. But do I think the NFL had it? Yeah, because they basically have an FBI of their own, where in any other case of someone acting up, they seem to have a dossier before the people wake up in the morning.
But here's the thing, there's two things about it, because it's interesting that you say that, because that was my impression, but I was listening to some of the New York stations, and all these guys calling in, claiming in to be casino insiders, would say, yeah, if the NFL called up, we'd give them that tape right away. And I didn't buy that.
Yeah.
But the other aspect too is that ultimately, I found this on CNN. The tape that the NFL supposedly got was given unauthorized from a police officer who was unauthorized to release that.
That makes sense, knowing Atlantic County, like the police and AC.
And some cavalier guy could have went, I think this is wrong, so I'm going to send it on. In any other form, that's a legally obtained evidence.
Yeah.
Should a commissioner be able to use that information to ban someone? I think with the TMZ thing, Rebel closed. Some guy said, I got this tape, they paid for it, and that's how it got out. I still do believe the NFL had it, but to protect the NFL, punishing someone with this, because remember, if Ray Rice sues the NFL over his punishment, that endangers their antitrust exemption.
Right.
And now the NFL wants to protect that as they can. That's why they try to deal with these things as in-house as they can. Because essentially, the NFL commissioner does have this ultimate power that no other industry we would allow that to happen. The government would step in there and say no. That's why I think this is weighty here, quite weighty.
Well, since we have a member of the press, I'd like to just have a particular question based on how do you think, Brian, the press has handled this as far as getting the story out in a credible manner, and have they hyped it and made him a scapegoat in order to get ratings and generate interest?
I didn't interpret this one as your typical clickbait / on the news all the time to boost ratings. I guess the press got caught up in the same groundswell that the public did, insofar as the second they saw, everybody knew what Ray Rice did in that elevator. But once everybody saw that, I don't know, was a 2-minute long clip of it, there's nothing else major going on in news on those days, so it gets more time on the national broadcasts. I don't think they did go overboard, and I can't speak for everybody in the media because I only know 30 people. But I don't think there was a concerted campaign to scapegoat Ray Rice as much as it kind of happened organically between the omnipresence of the NFL, the level of coverage it gets all the time anyway, and the day's news when it broke.
I think there's a concerted effort to scapegoat Roger Goodell.
Well, that's a different question.
And that may be far more deserved in terms of who was forthcoming. According to what we read, Ray Rice was forthcoming about what he did. Perhaps not that he spit on his wife twice before she pushed him away, but we don't really know all the details there. But as the story's playing out, Ray Rice told them what he did, and then the NFL and everybody else didn't quite see it until they saw it on the video, and then put 2 and 2 together, and then backed up and said, well, who else knew about this, and what about Roger Goodell, who's I think characterized, rightly or wrongly, as an imperious kind of czar of a professional sport who's created billions of dollars for the owners, gives a man hug to every single guy who's drafted in the NFL, and is a bit full of himself. And he's sitting up there on a pedestal making judgments, and this judgment, in hindsight, is looking pretty bad. So Roger Goodell has a lot of problems on his hands, as does the league with his leadership and the whole program about relentless incidents of domestic violence in the NFL. And we know because in 1 week, we've got 5 or 6 more of them. Do you think this is the only week that guys have been beating up their girlfriends? Hell, the guy, whoever he is, the defensive end from somebody somewhere.
Greg Hardy,
What's his name?
Greg Hardy.
Greg Hardy. I mean, he punched his girlfriend in the face in July, and now that's come to light, and on it goes. So we're going to see a lot more of this stuff, and it's been going on for years, decades, and whatever, because it's a violent sport by big, violent people who have certain attitudes about what they can do with women, and I think this is one of the biggest moments in professional sports history in regard to this, the violence that goes on and how it carries over into relationships. And you're seeing a huge amount of media attention on college campuses in the very same way.
Oh, yeah.
The Violence Against Women's Act was just reauthorized. Higher education, the military, many institutions really putting the hot light on sexual assault, domestic violence, sexual violence. So this is one of the most prominent emerging social issues in the last several decades.
I want to touch on like the violence part of the game. For most of my life, I played the game, and yes, it is violent. I don't play it to the level that they do, but I saw it as more of a channel for that, for the violence or the anger that I had just growing up through my experiences, and I saw it really, as most sports are, as a metaphor for life in general. And the main principles that I got out of it were hard work, perseverance, determination, and most definitely discipline. And I think the key one to highlight in all these cases is the discipline part, is the fact that these guys are so good growing up and they're so just glorified. The game is almost as if they're so good that they're not disciplined by their coaches, by their families, and they're put on a pedestal above anything else. It kind of supersedes what is right. The game takes over. As you see most recently, Jameis Winston at FSU, the guy's repeatedly violated so many clauses in the NCAA, and all he gets is a half of suspension. So I feel like, just the people need discipline.
For me, that's more of a society issue. And it's not necessarily the players' fault, or not necessarily the league's fault. I think it's more of society because we put them on a pedestal. We watch the games every Sunday and we're like, wow, this is awesome. The Eagles are playing, blah, blah, blah. So for me, I think a big part of that goes back to the point I stated earlier. The NFL or any institution, it's really important for these men or women to get therapy, counseling. I think that's a big part of it because, again, it's more of a slap on the wrist, and who knows if they're going back to do it again. But I think if there's another part of the, discipline and the sanctions that go on with these gentlemen, I think it will help.
But I think you raise it.
Well, I was going to bring you in on this one particular, but this was another one. Is the correct response here? Are we wrong for wanting to continue to pay to go to NFL games? Is that the rebuke that needs to be done here?
See,
Yeah. We're neighbors.
well, this raises a larger issue that I think is the issue that's underneath all of this, and it's where power operates and how power manifests and the ways in which we as people in the world. I don't believe that power works from the top down. I think that we're always complicit in allowing people to have certain power. And I'm thinking of power as broadly as possible. So celebrity power, in other words, corporate power.
Or athletic power.
Athletic power. I mean, it to my mind is we need to examine that more closely and have a real conversation at all kind of levels in all institutions, because it's both the expression of and the abuse of power, but not just by the person, a singular individual. It's by all of us.
But isn't that the nature of democracy? Almost, I'm sorry, the republic. That's basically what we do. We subcontract people to make these decisions for us, so that we can say, look, we don't have to be the judge and jury.
I don't. Do you
but no, I'm not talking. Yeah, but I think we're kind of conditioned as that.
No. Do you want my honest response?
Yeah.
I think democracy is a failure, and I think we need to reinvent a new way of governing ourselves.
I'd love to have you in my class. Listen up, students. I love to have this class.
Or at least it's an experiment that hasn't fully realized it.
Because we don't trust each other, essentially, and we don't. And the one thing is we want everybody to do the right thing. And then those who don't do the right thing need to be sanctioned. But then we sit there, how much sanctioning should we do? And, it gets really complicated. Sorry, Carmen.
talking about power, I think Ray Rice has a lot of power, and you were talking about discipline. The NFL has a great opportunity right now to fire Ray Rice, and then Ray Rice has a fantastic opportunity with his power to create a new image for himself, to speak up about domestic violence. He can say to the NFL, I promise not to do it again, or he can take a year off, publicly announce that he's making changes, and really shed light on domestic violence. He has that power, and that would be wonderful to do, because right now there are so many women of domestic violence, and same thing with rape, which is considered violence. Women don't speak up about it because there's so much skepticism. And it would be really nice for Ray Rice to take this ownership.
But here's my thing on that, because you take Mike Vick. He did the rounds, atone for what he does, but there are still people who don't, he's just doing what he has to do to reform the image. Does he really repent for what he did? Does he really believe that animals have rights now? How do you break away from that skepticism as well? I got to make the rounds because I got caught, and I want to say all the right things and reform my image. And if that's my way back in the NFL, even more incentive for me.
If he goes back into the NFL and then he makes a mistake again, then he should be suspended.
But isn't the whole
indefinitely.
point not to make the mistake again?
Here's the thing. Yes, let's have an argument about whether human beings are flawed. They are. So you can say the same thing. You said someone robs a bank, they go to jail for 5 years, they leave. And then what are you going to say? Like, we should monitor them all the time? No, if they make the same mistake, then there's another consequence. Same thing for Ray Rice. Maybe he'll have that opportunity again if he goes into the NFL.
Think about this. You have things like Megan's Law, where you continually be monitored. It's not perfect. It's got a lot of flaws with it. Are we okay with that? Or is that just because it really only deals with these sexual crimes against and in public against children? That's the line we draw. If it's that, then we can monitor you till you die. Essentially.
You're referring to the law that effectively gives a life sentence for those convicted of sex crimes against children to be monitored for the rest of their lives.
And their neighbors can.
Yeah, and you can go to a public website and find out which sex offenders are living next door to you, and that's forever. Yeah, and that's a really controversial and difficult law.
Because we got to protect the children, right?
Right.
Voting.
Yes,
that's
brand somebody for life that they were convicted of a sex crime.
Because recidivism in a crime, we say it's lower for someone, higher for some. Is it rehabilitative or is it just punitive? And if it's rehabilitative, then there shouldn't even be a question there could be a next time. We have to trust that the system is rehabilitative. Sorry.
How is it not trial and error? So, for instance, you fire him, he goes, trial is, we're going to let you go for a year, 2 years, see how you do, and then bring him back, error, then you're done.
But if the whole pretense was he learned his lesson, that's the difficulty here, is that, we have to wait till he does it again, and that proves it somehow, that he didn't learn, then that's where he's punished. I don't know if that brings the societal shift that we're looking for here.
There's a cat years angle to that too, insofar as 1 year as an NFL player is 10 human years.
Yeah, like it's forever. Like you can't, if you're an athlete and you take a year off or just expect to come back and be as good as you were, like you're not gonna be. And then all that build up pressure on top of him not being as good at the game will probably make worse in the fact that he'll probably do domestic violence again or go back to his bad habits, like DUIs or something.
We have a very interested outside observer. So for the radio audience, we have a number of outside observers not sitting in the circle, but we will give her the opportunity.
I'm Debbie Goldberg. I work in public relations. This is such an interesting discussion that I'm just finding it hard to not say. I just want to make a couple of points. Number one, Michael Vick. He did do something. He served time. He was given the opportunity to come back into the league. I think child sexual offenders have a very high rate of recidivism. I think that there's a lot more questionable, lot more of a question about whether or not someone really can be counseled out of that, or effectively treated. So that's a different issue, but I think Michael Vick is a good example of someone who was given an opportunity. I think domestic violence is a little bit of a different issue. The other thing I want to say is that about, the commissioner and his decision versus when the tape came out, in some ways I think that cell phones and cameras everywhere have really broadened democracy. And it's one thing to say, okay, he hit someone in an elevator, or the cops beat someone on the street, but when there is video and it's out there for the public, it just changes the nature, and it helps us keep people, society, keep those who are in charge of making some of these decisions, I think, more honest. Then we go back and we're holding them to the fire.
But that is our duty to society then, to constantly have our camera phones out, to look at each other, make sure that nobody's transgressing these rules of society.
People do it anyway. People are going to do it. I mean,
So we have to normalize this practice. That this.
Oh, God. Yes.
I know that's popping in your head.
I mean,
Professor
as
Ray.
a privacy advocate, the thought that I'm being watched constantly, it would be wonderful when you're caught doing bad things, but what happens when you're caught doing private things or things you don't want to share? I'm not comfortable at all with a camera on every street corner and in every pocket, unfortunately. But what I want to we're getting off topic, and that can be the subject of another roundtable,
Yes.
but I really want to address to the football player, Graham, and to our soccer coach. We've been talking about this issue, and I really want to know your opinion. Is it because they are in sports, and it's in violent sports, that makes them violent people? Or are they reacting as any person would? That's because Graham talked about discipline, which would seem to be the other way around, that they're learning to discipline their emotions in violence. Is because they're football players, they're more prone to violence?
I honestly don't see it as that way. I think it's just the person itself. It's him, herself. It doesn't. It's not because of the sport. It's not. It's just a coincidence that it happens to happen. There's plenty of players in the league. I think there's like 2,000-3,000 people in the league, and you only have cases of what I think I said earlier, 87 cases of it
That we know about.
That we know about. Yeah,
And that's a key thing here. Domestic violence is one of the most underreported of the crimes against women.
Yeah, but the numbers, it's just a coincidence that they happen to be in the NFL, that they're playing football, that they're in sports. I don't see it as direct relation to that.
I think it happens everywhere, and it's unfortunate again, but I think that when you play a sport like that at such a high level, it becomes a part of you. I mean, to be honest with you, I think unfortunately it's unfortunate for some of these guys, and they sustain multiple injuries because of it. But
Is there a concussion issue here? Because that was kind of one of the issues a few years ago. The fact that the hits to the head, and the effects of chronic brain trauma lead to personality changes.
I mean, if you think about it, I mean, some of these athletes have been taught since they were 5 years old. I'm sure you were. Instill pain on the next guy, pretty much.
Punt the ball and everybody goes get the ball.
Exactly.
Right?
So
Right?
I don't think that it's the whole reason, but I do feel that it's a part of it.
Well, my experience is that the testosterone levels, adrenaline levels, and the physical imposing nature of these athletes can be a toxic combination. So I don't think it's coincidental that the NFL is on the front page for this sort of thing. This particular sport with these very, very physical, highly charged athletes, and you can say something for leaving it on the field, and I'm sure Peyton Manning does, but there's a lot of guys who don't,
Yeah.
and it's coming to the public notice.
Caroline.
I find that, frankly, to be ridiculous. Behavior.
Thank you, Karen.
Behavior is socially conditioned, and while we can make the argument is, yes, you're socially conditioned through your sport to become violent at home, what I really think would be important to analyze is socioeconomics before you begin your sport. Because there's a huge discrepancy in household.
Well, we take the
finances.
Adrian Pearson issue recently. I know we're starting down the train, but
It's a whole
but
other
you know, but I think that May is apt as there as well. You know, that's how he says what he said. That's how I was brought up.
Well, no, but I think she raises a good point where I don't think we are going too far off because we're decontextualizing
Yeah.
everything. I mean, to not look at the larger picture, I think, and all the social conditions, not just economic, but that treat, or I mean, that teach certain values, certain behaviors, that those codes are the way to survive, or to be legible in certain ways.
But to both of that, then isn't this, if I lash out at home, that means I can't draw the line between the game and home. And is that an indicator that maybe I am not able or should play the game if I can't make that distinction? I know it's a tough one. I mean, anyways,
I think-
the kind of, okay, go ahead, Monica.
I think it's totally different from when you're on the field and off the field. You're two completely different people. Like, on the field, might be more, I don't know, like, in softball terms, you might be more loud and outgoing, and then off the field, you might be, like, quiet and shy. It depends. Like, football people, you might be the meanest person on the field, but off the field, you're, like, doing charity work. Like, it doesn't matter. So, the fact that the sport directly, like, affects you in your social life, I don't think it directly affects you. Does it play a role? Yes. Does it shape you as a person and as a student athlete or like an athlete as a person? Yes. But sports don't cause damage. I think they do good. Like
They outweigh good.
Yeah, they outweigh
Yeah.
good. Yeah, they help you build up to be a better person because you're letting off all that anger on the field. So
One last thing I'll say is I believe that people are intelligent enough to distinguish the difference between being on a football field, wearing a uniform, cleats, running around in dirt, and being home inside a house. People are intelligent enough to know the difference.
If I
Right,
go back
that's
to
where-
the brain injuries aspect of it, I wouldn't dismiss that outright, actually, that it could have an impact. I got my head banged up a few years ago, and I'm not beating people in elevators or throwing punches, but I do notice some differences in, I guess, patience and, well, just patience, really. Just getting
I mean, it used to be an
frustrated
issue for
quickly.
boxers mainly,
That's-
that
yeah,
you saw
so-
those changes in people.
Yeah, and
Well,
if they're
anyway,
changing, it could play a role in it.
I want to thank everyone for being here. I thought it was a very productive conversation, and I mean, there's a lot of things left on the table. This is a cultural issue, a social issue. I mean, we're never meant to come to particular answers today, but I think it was very productive. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Appreciate
you.
it.